She showed up at his door in the middle of a storm, soaking wet, trembling, holding an envelope like it was the last thing keeping her together. She wasn't there for shelter. She wasn't there for comfort. She looked him dead in the eyes and said 7 words that would change both of their lives forever. I need a husband by Friday. What happens next? Nobody saw coming. If this already has your heart racing, you're not ready for what comes next. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when Jake Mercer finally gave up on sleep. He sat at the kitchen table of his farmhouse with a half-empty mug of black coffee, listening to the storm pound the metal roof like it had a personal grudge. The fields outside were invisible, swallowed whole by darkness and water. He didn't mind. Silence, even violent silence, was something he'd learned to live with. Preferred it most days. Then came the knock. Not gentle, not polite. The kind of knock that comes from a fist that's already tried the doorbell twice and stopped believing in it. Jake set the mug down slowly and moved through the hallway, flicking on the porch light before he opened the door. What he found on the other side made him go very still. Emily Walker stood in the downpour, her dark hair plastered to her face, her jacket soaked through to the skin. She was clutching a manila envelope against her chest with both arms, like she was afraid the rain might dissolve it. Her eyes, brown, wide, surrounded by the particular redness that comes not just from crying, but from hours of it, found his immediately. She didn't say anything at first, neither did he. She looked like she'd driven through the storm and walked the last 100 yards on foot. She looked like someone who had run out of options and ended up, by process of elimination, here. "Emily!" His voice came out lower than he intended. "What happened?" She swallowed. Her chin lifted the way it always had. He remembered that about her, even though they'd barely spoken more than a handful of times over the fence line. That small, stubborn lift, like she was bracing. "Can I come in?" He stepped back without a word. She crossed the threshold, dripping onto the hardwood, and Jake closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The kitchen light caught her face properly then, the exhaustion carved beneath her cheekbones, the tension locked into her jaw. She was 26, maybe 27. Right now, she looked older, in the way that grief makes people older overnight. He handed her a dish towel without asking. She pressed it to her face, then her hair, moving mechanically. "Your father," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 days ago. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "Heart attack. Fast." She paused. "He didn't suffer, they said." Jake nodded once. He'd heard something, seen the lights at the Walker place, the unfamiliar cars. He hadn't gone over. That was the kind of man he was, someone who respected the walls people built around their grief. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it plainly. Emily set the towel on the counter and looked at the envelope in her hands for a long moment. The kitchen hummed with the sound of rain and the low tick of the wall clock. She was working up to something. He could feel it the way you feel a shift in weather, not seeing it yet, just knowing. "Jake." She looked up. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you say no." He crossed his arms, not defensively, more like bracing himself. "All right." She placed the envelope on the table between them. Inside, he could see the edge of a legal document, the corner of something official and immovable. "My father's will has a condition. She kept her eyes on his, steady, though her fingers pressed flat against the table like she needed the surface. If I'm not married by Friday, this Friday, the farm passes entirely to my brother Grant. The clock ticked. Rain hit the window. Jake said nothing. I know how this sounds, she said quickly. I know exactly how this sounds. But the farm is all I have left of him. I've worked that land since I was 17. Grant hasn't set foot on it in 4 years. He'll sell it within a month, to developers, to whoever makes the highest offer, and everything my father built will be gone. She stopped, breathed. I need a husband by Friday. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind that fills up with everything two people aren't saying yet, the weight of the ask, the impossibility of it, and underneath all of that, something else. Something Jake couldn't name yet, and wasn't sure he wanted to. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Start from the beginning, he said. Tell me everything. The will was 3 pages long, but the clause that mattered fit into a single paragraph. Emily smoothed it flat on the table with the palm of her hand, and Jake leaned forward to read it without touching it, like he wasn't quite ready to make contact with something that real. The kitchen light fell across the page in a clean, unforgiving line. The language was formal, dry, the kind of legal phrasing designed to leave no room for interpretation. The property known as Walker Farm shall transfer in full to the eldest surviving heir, Grant Thomas Walker, in the event that Emily Rose Walker remains unmarried at the time of the estate settlement, scheduled no later than the Friday following the reading of this document. Jake read it twice. Then he sat back. When was this written? 8 months ago. Emily's voice was quiet but precise. After Grant got out of his second business failure, Dad never said a word to me about it. I think he thought... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I think he thought he had more time. And Grant already knows. He was at the reading yesterday morning. Something shifted in her expression, not quite anger, more like the cold recognition of something she'd hoped wouldn't be true. He was there with his own attorney. He had a copy of the will before I did. Jake exhaled slowly through his nose. He'd seen Grant Walker once or twice over the years, the kind of man who filled a room with noise and left it with less than it started with, the kind of man who called things investments when he meant things I intend to take. So he's already moving. He's already called 2 of our suppliers. Her jaw tightened. Told them the farm is likely to change hands by the weekend, starting to cut the threads before I can even count them. The coffee between them had gone cold. Neither of them reached for it. Jake turned the page over slowly, not reading anymore, just thinking. There was a version of this conversation where he said no, walked her back to the door, watched her tail lights disappear down the road, and went back to his life exactly as it was. Quiet, uncomplicated, sealed. He was aware of that version. He was aware that it was the simpler one. But there was something in the way Emily sat across from him, spine straight despite everything, eyes tired but not broken, that made the word no feel less available than it should have. Why me? He asked. She didn't hesitate. Because you're next door. Because you knew my father. Because you're not connected to anyone in town who would make this complicated. A beat. And because I think you're someone who keeps his word. That last part landed differently than the rest. He looked at her. You don't really know me, Emily. No, she agreed. But my father did. He mentioned you more than once. She paused and something quieter moved across her face. He said you were a man who did what he said he'd do. That's rarer than people think. The rain had softened outside, from a roar to a steady hiss against the glass. Jake stood and moved to the window, not for any reason except that he needed a moment where she wasn't looking directly at him. He'd been alone on this farm for 4 years. Not unhappily, or so he'd told himself. He'd built a life around its edges. The early mornings, the physical work, the particular piece of land that didn't ask anything of you except effort. He hadn't missed the complications of people, not consciously. He turned back around. I have one condition. Emily stilled. No lies, he said. Between us, whatever this is, it stays honest. What we say to each other is real. I don't care what we tell other people to make this work, but inside those walls—" He nodded toward the house around them. "Nothing false." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Deal." He reached across the table, and they shook hands, brief, firm, the kind of handshake that means something. Her hand was cold from the rain, and his was warm, and neither of them mentioned the 2 seconds longer than necessary that they held on. "You should get dry," he said. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." She picked up the envelope, tucked it under her arm, and moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused with her back to him. "Jake." Her voice was softer now, stripped of the rehearsed steadiness. "Thank you." He didn't answer right away. Just watched the door close quietly behind her, the storm filling the silence she left behind, and felt something shift in the house that had nothing to do with the weather. The courthouse smelled like old paper and central air conditioning. It was a Wednesday morning, overcast and still, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and waits. Emily had worn a cream-colored blouse tucked into dark trousers, her hair pulled back simply, a single gold stud in each ear that had belonged to her mother. She hadn't tried to make it look like a wedding. That would have felt dishonest, and dishonesty, as of 2 nights ago, was off the table. Jake wore a dark button-down and his cleanest jeans. He'd shaved. She noticed and then immediately looked away for noticing. The justice of the peace was a compact man named Harold, who had the practiced warmth of someone who'd done this a few hundred times and still chose to mean it. He shook both their hands, confirmed their names against the license, and moved through the legal language with quiet efficiency. Emily stood beside Jake and stared at a point just past Harold's left shoulder. She was holding her own hands in front of her, fingers laced, and Jake stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. Not touching, just present. A solid, quiet presence that she found herself orienting toward without meaning to. "Do you, Jacob Daniel Mercer, take Emily Rose Walker? Don't think about it," she told herself. "It's paperwork. It's just paperwork with witnesses." "I do," Jake said. Low and even, like he'd decided already and didn't need the moment to confirm it. Harold turned to her. She said the words. They came out steadier than she felt. Then Harold said, "You may place the ring." She hadn't thought about rings. Jake apparently had, because he reached into the front pocket of his jeans and produced a simple silver band, plain and unadorned, the kind you could buy at any jewelry counter. Nothing theatrical, nothing that pretended to be more than it was. But when he reached for her hand, something shifted. His fingers wrapped around hers to steady them. She hadn't realized she was trembling until he did. And the ring slid into place with a quiet, final certainty that went directly through her sternum. She stared at her own hand for a moment. His thumb stayed at the edge of her knuckle, a half-second longer than the ceremony required, and then he let go. She didn't look up at him right away. Harold said something warm and conclusory. There was a pen, a document, 2 signatures, and then it was done. They walked out into the grey morning as husband and wife, and the word felt like wearing someone else's coat, present, undeniable, not quite fitting yet. The drive to Walker Farm was mostly quiet. Emily watched the familiar road unspool through the windshield, the flat fields opening up on either side, the oak tree at the property line she'd climbed as a child. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. When they pulled up to the house, 3 of the farm's staff were near the equipment barn. All 3 stopped what they were doing. Diane, who'd worked the Walker land longer than Emily had been alive, shielded her eyes against the flat light and looked from Emily to Jake and back again with an expression that asked a full paragraph's worth of questions in under 2 seconds. On the far side of the yard, a dark SUV was parked at an angle near the fence. Grant. He was leaning against it with his arms crossed, wearing a jacket that cost more than most people's rent, watching them get out of the truck with a look that was trying very hard to be indifferent and failing. Jake didn't acknowledge him. He came around the truck, stood beside Emily and said quietly, just for her, "Don't react. Let him see it didn't work." She nodded once and kept walking. Grant said nothing as they passed, but she felt his stare on the back of her neck like a splinter. Inside, the house settled around them with its familiar smells: cedar, coffee, the faint trace of her father's pipe tobacco that still lived in the walls. Emily set her keys on the counter and stood in the kitchen for a moment with both hands flat on the surface, just breathing. Jake moved through the space without intruding on it. He looked at the photographs on the wall, the worn calendar still open to last month, the half-finished puzzle on the side table that her father had been working on. He touched nothing, just looked. They'd agreed on the logistics that morning. He'd stay in the guest room, maintain the appearance for legal purposes, and be present enough to satisfy whatever scrutiny the estate attorney brought. Clean, contained, manageable. That was the plan. Later, after supper, sandwiches eaten mostly in comfortable silence, Emily climbed the stairs and paused at the top of the landing. The guest room door was closed. She could hear the low murmur of Jake moving around inside, the soft sound of a drawer. She stood there for a moment she couldn't entirely explain. Then she said quietly, into the space between their two closed doors, "Thank you. For today." A pause. Then his voice, low and unhurried, came back through the wood. "Get some sleep, Emily." She did, eventually. But for a long time she lay with her eyes open in the dark, the new ring still on her finger, listening to the old house breathe around her, wondering what exactly she had set in motion. The first supplier showed up at 7:15 in the morning. Emily heard the truck before she saw it, diesel engine, heavy tires on gravel, and came out onto the porch still pulling her hair back, coffee in hand. The driver was a man named Curtis, who'd been delivering feed to Walker Farm for 11 years. He was in his 50s, wide-shouldered, with the particular brand of patience that belongs to men who've spent decades working with animals and difficult weather. He looked at Emily the way men like Curtis sometimes looked at women who'd inherited something, like he was still deciding whether or not to take her seriously. "Miss Walker." He touched the brim of his cap, not impolitely, but not quite respectfully either. "Need to talk about the account balance before I unload." Emily set her coffee on the porch railing. "How much?" 63 days out." He named a number that landed like a stone. "Company policy is 45. I've been flexible because of your father, but I'll have it cleared by end of week." Her voice was even. "All of it." Curtis tilted his head slightly, the way people do when they're deciding whether someone means what they say. "Emily." Jake's voice came from behind her. He'd appeared at the porch door, flannel shirt, work boots already on, mug in hand. He looked at Curtis with the unhurried calm of a man who owned his own square footage of the world. "Morning." Curtis straightened fractionally. "Mercer." "She said end of week," Jake said simply. "You'll have it." Something in the exchange recalibrated. Curtis nodded, said he'd note it on the account, and went to unload the truck without further negotiation. Emily waited until he was out of earshot before she turned. "I didn't need that." "I know." Jake took a sip of his coffee. "I wasn't doing it for Curtis." She looked at him. "You've got 3 more conversations like that one before lunch," he said. "Might as well save the energy." She wanted to argue. She understood, with some irritation, that he wasn't wrong. The morning unfolded in layers of exactly that kind of thing. Small tests wearing the costume of routine. A farmhand named Dylan, who'd been with the property 2 seasons and had apparently decided that Emily's authority was provisional, started questioning her call on rotating the east pasture. Not rudely, just with the particular persistence of someone who expects to be deferred to. Jake watched from the fence line. He didn't step in. When Dylan's third reframing of the same objection came around, Emily turned to him with a patience that had gone very quiet and very precise, the way still water runs deep. "I grew up on this land, Dylan. I know that pasture. We're rotating it. That's the decision." Dylan looked at Jake, instinctively, reflexively, the way people look for a higher court. Jake's expression offered him absolutely nothing. Dylan nodded and walked off. Emily turned back to the fence post she'd been inspecting and said nothing. But Jake saw her shoulders drop half an inch, the release of something she'd been holding tightly all morning. He came to stand beside her at the fence. There was a section of post that had been listing for weeks, the base rotted through at the soil line. He crouched down and checked it with his hand, pressing the wood. It gave too easily. "Walk me through your replacement inventory," he said. "What?" Posts, wire, hardware, what you have on hand, she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she was starting to understand was something he did intentionally, not filling space just to fill it. When she finished, he suggested a sourcing option that would cut the material cost by 1/3. How do you know that supplier? Used them for my south fence last spring. He stood, brushing soil from his knee. I'll send you the contact. They worked through most of the afternoon side by side, not always talking, sometimes not talking at all. The comfortable silence of two people focused on the same problem. At some point, Emily realized she wasn't bracing herself anymore. The constant low-level tension she'd been carrying since her father's death, that exhausting readiness for the next thing to go wrong, had loosened just slightly. Around 4 o'clock, she made a calculation error on the feed ratios and caught it herself, then muttered something under her breath that made Jake look over. Say it out loud, he said. I miscalculated the supplemental ratio for the North herd. By how much? She told him. He considered it. Catch it before feeding time, it's fine. You caught it. I should have caught it earlier. Do it again. His voice was unhurried. You almost had it right. She looked up at him. He was already looking back at the inventory sheet in his hand, perfectly calm, as though the most ordinary thing in the world was someone standing next to you and simply refusing to let you be harder on yourself than the situation required. It was the first time she'd smiled, really smiled, unguarded and unplanned, since her father died. And Jake turned just slightly to check the fence line before she could see that he'd noticed. But he had. He'd noticed everything. The day's work ended the way good work always does, not with a sharp stop, but with a gradual unwinding. The sun had dropped low enough to turn everything amber, that particular late afternoon light that makes ordinary things look like they mean something. The field stretched out beyond the porch railing in long copper shadows, and the air had cooled just enough to feel like a reward. Emily came out with 2 mugs of coffee she'd reheated twice already, handed one to Jake without asking, and sat down in the wooden chair beside his. Neither of them spoke for a while. That was becoming its own kind of language between them. The coffee was too strong and slightly bitter, and she drank it anyway because it was her father's blend, the same dark roast he'd ordered every month from a small outfit in Tennessee, and she hadn't been able to bring herself to switch it. Jake didn't comment on the taste. He just drank it in the same unhurried way he did most things. He used to sit out here every evening, Emily said finally, not loudly, just releasing it into the air. Didn't matter how bad the day was, he'd come out here with his coffee and just watch the fields go dark, like he was checking on them one last time before bed. Jake turned his mug in his hand slowly. Sounds like a man who knew what he had. He did. She pulled one knee up to her chest, her boot heel on the edge of the chair. He just never said it out loud, not in words. A pause. He'd show up, though. That was his language. If you were struggling with something, he didn't say, I love you. He just appeared. Fixed the thing. Stayed until it was handled. The horizon had gone from amber to deep rose, the sky above it shifting into something bruised and beautiful. A nighthawk crossed the far tree line in a low, tilting arc. My mother used to say he was emotionally unavailable, Emily continued, a faint wry edge in her voice. She wasn't entirely wrong, but I always thought, I don't know. There's something to be said for the person who just keeps showing up. Jake was quiet for a moment, then, yeah, there is. Something in the way he said it made her look at him. He was still watching the horizon, jaw relaxed, but there was something in his expression that had shifted, a small opening, like a window lifted half an inch. What about you? She asked. Your farm. You've been out here, what, 4 years? Almost 5. Alone the whole time? He considered whether to answer. She could see him consider it, not evasively, but honestly, the way a private person decides whether the question deserves the real answer or the convenient one. Yes, he said. Mostly by choice. Mostly. The edge of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. You're going to make me finish that sentence. I'm not making you do anything. He looked at her then, directly, and she held it. The evening light caught the angles of his face, and for a moment he looked less like a man who'd built walls and more like a man who'd simply stopped leaving the door open. "I was with someone," he said. "For a long time. It ended, and I came here. I told myself it was about the land, about building something of my own, a beat. That was partly true. And the other part? Easier to be alone than to be with someone who makes you feel more alone than the empty house does." The words settled between them like something solid. Emily didn't fill the space after them. She understood, with the precision of personal experience, exactly what he meant. "My father would have liked you," she said softly. Jake turned to look at her. Something passed across his face, brief, unguarded, real. "He mentioned you were stubborn," he said. She laughed, an actual laugh, short and surprised, and entirely unself-conscious. "He told you that?" "Over the fence, last summer." Jake's voice carried something warmer now, an ease that hadn't been there before. He said, and I'm quoting, "My daughter doesn't quit at anything, which is mostly a virtue and occasionally a headache." Emily pressed her lips together, her eyes bright. "That is completely accurate." The laughter settled back into quiet, but it was a different quiet now, softer, closer. The sky had deepened to indigo at the edges, the first faint stars appearing above the eastern tree line. Neither of them moved toward the door. At some point, Emily set her empty mug on the railing and rested her head back against the chair, looking up. Jake stayed where he was, forearms on his knees, and for a long moment they simply existed in the same space without needing to manage it. Two people who had both, in their own separate ways, gotten used to evenings alone, now finding that this was something different, better maybe, in a way that neither of them was ready to say out loud yet. "I should check on the north herd before it gets fully dark," she said eventually, without moving. "Yeah," he agreed, without moving either. Another minute passed. Then she stood, collected both mugs, and went inside without another word. Jake stayed on the porch after she left. He leaned back in the chair, looked out at the fields now barely visible in the falling dark, and didn't move for a long time. Something had shifted in the evening air between them, quiet and irreversible, like the turn of a season. He couldn't point to the moment it happened. He wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. The call came Thursday morning, just after 6. Emily was already up. She'd been sleeping lighter since her father died, her body refusing the deeper hours, as if rest had become a kind of guilt. She was in the kitchen when her phone buzzed against the counter, and the name on the screen made her jaw tighten before she even answered. It was Marcus, the farm's operations manager. 14 years with Walker Farm, the kind of man her father had trusted completely. "Emily." His voice was careful in a way that meant he'd been up for a while with something he didn't want to say. "I need to talk to you before the day starts." She set down her coffee. "Tell me." He'd been approached the evening before, he said. Someone had called his personal number, which he hadn't given out freely, and offered him a position with a corporate agricultural firm 3 counties over. Better salary, company truck, full benefits. The offer had been framed as an opportunity, but Marcus, who was not a naive man, had recognized the timing for what it was. "Grant's behind it," Emily said. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't take it," Marcus said. "I want you to know that, but I think you should know he's trying." After she hung up, she stood very still in the kitchen for a long moment. The morning light came through the window above the sink in a flat, honest line. She heard Jake's footsteps on the stairs, that particular unhurried cadence she'd already learned to recognize, and when he appeared in the doorway, she didn't bother softening her expression. He read it immediately. "What happened?" she told him. All of it. The call to Marcus, the supplier pressure earlier in the week. The attorney Grant had arrived with 2 days ago, who'd spent 40 minutes in the driveway asking pointed questions about the timeline of their marriage before Emily had firmly ended the conversation. Jake listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his coffee untouched on the counter. "He's not attacking the farm," Jake said. "He's attacking your ability to run it. Make you look unstable to the creditors, pull the people who hold it together, then show up to the estate attorney with a picture of collapse." He looked at her steadily. "It's not subtle, but it doesn't need to be. It just needs to work fast enough." "I know." Emily crossed her arms, Not out of defense, but containment, like she was holding something together inside her chest that wanted to scatter. I've already called the 2 suppliers he contacted, confirmed our accounts, got verbal commitments to hold. She paused. The attorney is the part I can't fix with a phone call. I'll handle that. She looked at him sharply. Jake, not your problem to manage alone. His voice was quiet, but final. The kind of final that doesn't leave room for negotiation without effort. You didn't sign up for a war with my brother. No, he agreed, but I gave you my word. That covers more than the paperwork. There was something in his expression. Not anger, nothing heated, just a clear, cold certainty. The look of a man who has decided something and closed the door on reconsidering it. Emily had seen that look on her father's face once or twice in her life. It had always made her feel simultaneously safer and slightly afraid of what came next. Jake found Grant's SUV parked at the edge of the Walker property just after 9. Grant was leaning against the hood with his phone, looking like a man who was comfortable taking up space that didn't belong to him. Jake walked up and stopped at a distance that was close enough to be intentional. Grant looked up slowly. Mercer. His tone carried the particular laziness of someone who wants you to know they're not threatened. Didn't realize you were part of the operation now. I'm not here about the operation. Jake's voice was even, conversational almost. I'm here to tell you once, clearly so there's no confusion later, that what you're doing stops now. The calls to suppliers, the offer to Marcus, whatever your attorney is building. Grant's expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes. I don't know what you're... Grant. Jake said his name without impatience and without heat. Just a single word that meant we both know better, so let's not. I don't have a temper about this. I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling you that every move you make from here gets documented, and the estate attorney will have a full picture of the interference by Friday morning. A pause. Your call. A long silence passed between them. A crow called somewhere in the tree line. Grant's jaw moved slightly, the way jaws do when something is being swallowed rather than said. Then he pushed off the hood, pocketed his phone, and got into the SUV without another word. Emily had watched from the kitchen window. She hadn't meant to. She'd told herself she wouldn't, but she'd watched anyway. Watched Jake walk back across the yard at the same unhurried pace he'd left with, like nothing extraordinary had happened, like he hadn't just quietly dismantled the most threatening thing in her week. She stepped back from the window before he reached the porch, but the feeling that settled in her chest as she did, warm and unexpected and slightly terrifying, didn't step back with her. The documents were in the third drawer of her father's desk. Emily had been working through the office systematically. Invoices, contracts, maintenance logs, the particular archaeology of a man who kept everything on paper and filed nothing intuitively. It was slow, necessary work, the kind that required a specific emotional endurance. Every handwritten note in her father's uneven script was a small ambush. She almost missed it. A folder tucked beneath a stack of equipment warranties unlabeled, the kind of deliberate misfiling that meant someone hadn't wanted it found quickly. Inside was a 2-year-old loan agreement, private, not through the bank, between Robert Walker and Jacob Mercer. $40,000, collateral listed as the Eastern Acre parcel of Walker Farm. Emily sat very still at the desk for a long moment. She read it again. The terms were clean, the repayment schedule straightforward. But there was no record of repayment anywhere in the folder. No receipts, no bank notations, no correspondence confirming the debt had been settled. Just the original agreement, sitting in a misfiled folder in a dead man's drawer, with Jake Mercer's signature at the bottom. She heard the back door open downstairs. Jake back from checking the irrigation line on the north field, his boots on the hardwood, the particular rhythm of it she'd memorized without intending to. She was in the kitchen when he came in. He looked at her face first, the way he always did that quiet read, and something shifted in his expression immediately. Not guilt, not alarm, something more careful than either of those things. What happened? He said. She put the folder on the counter between them without a word. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. When were you going to tell me? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That was the thing about a specific kind of hurt. It sometimes arrived wearing the mask of composure. Emily. There's a $40,000 loan with my father's land as collateral and your name on it, and you've been living in this house for 4 days and haven't said a single word." She kept her eyes on his. "I need to understand what that means." Jake pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. He didn't reach for the folder. He laced his hands on the table and looked at her directly, which she noted somewhere beneath the hurt was exactly what a man with nothing to hide would do. "Your father came to me 2 years ago," he said. "He'd had a bad season, equipment failures, a failed crop rotation in the south field. He needed a bridge loan fast and didn't want to go to the bank because he was afraid it would affect his credit line for the spring." "Why you?" "Because I had it, and because he asked." Something in Jake's voice was very quiet and very precise. "I wasn't doing him a favor he didn't deserve. Your father helped me in ways that didn't involve money when I first came here. This was the only way I could balance that. And the repayment. He made 12 payments. The last one was 8 months ago." A pause. Then he stopped. "I didn't push it. I figured he'd get back to it when the season leveled out." His jaw tightened slightly. "I didn't know he was sick." Emily looked at the table surface. The information rearranged itself slowly, the pieces fitting together differently than they had 5 minutes ago, the shape of it changing from something suspicious into something more complicated and more painful. "You should have told me," she said. Her voice was quieter now, but the hurt in it was more visible, not less. "Yes," he said simply. No justification. No layering. Just yes. "When I found this, my first thought was—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. "I thought you'd agreed to this arrangement because of the land, because of the collateral, because you had something to gain." Something moved across his face, brief and undefended, not anger. Something closer to the specific pain of being misread by someone whose opinion has started to matter. "I know," he said. "That's not a denial. It's not a confirmation either." He held her gaze steadily. "I don't want the land, Emily. I never did. That debt, whatever remains of it, I'll sign it over, forgiven right now if you want. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" The question came out rawer than she intended. It hung in the kitchen air between them, larger than the room. Jake looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and unforgiving through the window, and neither of them moved through it. Then he stood, and his voice when he spoke was careful. Not distant, not cold, but careful, the way you are with something you don't want to damage further. "I think you need some time with this," he said. "I'll be at my place tonight." He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He didn't slam it, he didn't make it dramatic, he just left, quietly, the way people leave when they've been hurt and have decided not to perform it. Emily stood in the kitchen alone for a long time after his truck left the driveway. The folder sat open on the counter. The house, which had begun in the last 4 days to feel less like an absence and more like a presence, settled back into its hollow quiet. She didn't cry. She just stood there in the silence, her hand flat on the counter beside the folder, feeling the specific weight of having said something that couldn't be unsaid, and the worse weight of not yet knowing if she'd been wrong to say it. Outside, the field she'd fought so hard to keep stretched all the way to the tree line, indifferent and enduring. They didn't have opinions about any of it. She almost envied them. Friday arrived the way consequential days often do, quietly, without ceremony, as if the calendar hadn't noticed what was at stake. Emily was up before dawn. She'd barely slept, and the hours she had were restless and shallow, full of half-formed thoughts that dissolved before she could hold them. She showered, dressed in dark slacks and a white blouse, and stood in front of the mirror for a moment doing the thing she'd trained herself not to do, looking for signs of how badly a night had gone in the lines of her own face. She looked tired. She looked determined. She supposed those two things had always coexisted in her. The estate attorney's office was in town, 40 minutes away. Marcus had offered to drive her. She'd told him she was fine, and she was, or she was close enough to find that the distinction didn't help anyone. She made coffee she didn't drink, fed the animals with methodical focus, and checked her phone twice without meaning to. No messages. The driveway was empty. Jake's truck had not come back. She told herself that was fine too. The drive into town was long in the particular way. Drives are long when your mind is working harder than the road requires. She rehearsed the meeting, the contracts she'd renewed, the accounts she'd settled, the operational records she'd organized into a clean, irrefutable picture of a farm that was not only surviving, but stabilizing. She had everything she needed. She had built the case herself, brick by careful brick over the last 4 days. She didn't need anyone to walk in with her. She told herself that several times. The attorney's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, the kind of space that smelled like mahogany and institutional patience. Emily arrived 8 minutes early and sat in the waiting area with her folder on her lap and her back straight and her hands entirely still. Grant arrived 4 minutes later with his attorney, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who carried his briefcase like a weapon. Grant looked at Emily with the particular expression of someone who has already decided the outcome and is merely waiting for the room to catch up with him. She looked back at him without expression and said nothing. The meeting started at 9. The estate attorney, a measured woman named Patricia Chen who had handled her father's affairs for over a decade, opened the session with procedural clarity and began working through the terms of the will with the unhurried precision of someone who had seen every version of this room before. Emily presented her documentation. 12 minutes in, the door to the office opened. Patricia Chen looked up. Grant's attorney looked up. Grant looked up. Jake stood in the doorway in a dark jacket, clean jeans, hair slightly damp like he'd driven fast from somewhere and hadn't stopped to think about appearances. He looked at Emily first, directly, no preamble, and something in his expression said everything his voice hadn't said last night. He crossed the room and sat down beside her without a word. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Under the table, her hand was resting on her knee, and after a moment his hand came to rest beside hers, not taking it, not making it a gesture for the room. Just there, present, an inch of warmth that said, "I'm not going anywhere." Patricia Chen resumed without comment. The next 40 minutes were methodical and precise. Emily walked through every document, renewed supplier contracts, settled accounts, current payroll records, a signed letter of continued commitment from Marcus, operational projections for the next 2 quarters. She answered every question Patricia Chen asked with the quiet confidence of someone who has done the work and knows it. Grant's attorney raised 3 objections. Patricia addressed each one in turn, briefly, without drama, the way you address things that don't have much ground to stand on. When the final review was complete, Patricia Chen removed her reading glasses, set them on the desk, and looked across at both parties with the even expression of someone delivering a conclusion that was never actually in doubt. Emily Walker Mercer has satisfied all conditions of the estate agreement, she said. Walker Farm transfers to her ownership in full effective today. Grant said nothing. His attorney made a note. The sharp-faced man packed his briefcase with slightly less authority than he'd unpacked it. Grant stood. He looked at Emily, a long look, complicated and unresolved, carrying in it something that might have been the distant cousin of regret. Then he walked out without a word, and the door closed behind him, and the room felt immediately larger. Patricia offered her hand to Emily with a warmth that was professional and genuine at once. "Your father would be proud," she said simply. Emily held it together through the handshake, just barely. Outside, the morning had opened up, the sky a clean, washed pale blue, the air carrying that particular late-spring clarity that makes everything look more itself. They walked to Jake's truck without talking, and she stood beside the passenger door for a moment, her folder against her chest, looking out at the street. "You didn't have to come," she said. "No," he agreed. "I had everything I needed." "You did." He turned to face her, leaning against the truck, hands in his pockets. "That's not why I came." She looked at him, really looked, at the steadiness in his face, at the man who had shown up without announcement and sat beside her without asking for acknowledgement, and said nothing in the room that needed to be said because his presence had already said it. "Jake." Her voice was softer now, the composure finally showing its edges. "Yesterday. What I implied. You were scared," he said simply. and you'd just found something that looked like a reason not to trust me. That's not an accusation. That's just what happened. I should have asked first. Yes. The edge of his mouth moved. You should have. She laughed, a small, exhausted, genuine sound. And then, because she was tired of the distance and done performing the composure, she stepped forward and put her arms around him. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just the simple human act of letting herself lean into someone solid. His arms came around her without hesitation. His chin dropped to the top of her head, and she felt him exhale, slow and deep, like he'd been holding something since last night and had only just now found somewhere to set it down. They stood like that on a quiet street in the late morning, the folder pressed between them and the keys still in his pocket, and the whole long week finally, mercifully still. "The debt," she said into his jacket. "I want to settle it properly. Whatever remains." "Emily, that's not negotiable." She pulled back enough to look at him. "But everything else—" She stopped. Her eyes searched his, steady and open, and no longer bracing for impact. "I don't want this to end, because a piece of paper says it can." Jake looked at her for a long moment in the clean morning light. His hand came up slowly and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and so deliberate that it said more than a speech could have carried. "The problem," he said quietly, "is that I didn't stay because of the will." His thumb traced the edge of her cheekbone, and his voice dropped to something that belonged only to the two of them. "I stayed because somewhere between the storm and the porch and the terrible coffee, I found the only place I've wanted to be in a long time." She held his gaze. Then she reached up, her hand covering his where it rested against her face, and for a moment they stood suspended in the kind of stillness that arrives just before something irrevocable and true. When she kissed him, it was unhurried and certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission because it has already been answered. He kissed her back the same way, one hand at her jaw, the other at the small of her back, like she was both something fragile and something he was absolutely sure of. Around them, the ordinary world continued indifferently. Traffic, birdsong, the distant sound of a shop door opening somewhere down the street. None of it touched them. When they finally stepped back, her forehead dropped briefly against his chest, and his hand rested at the back of her head, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was, at last, nothing urgent left to say. The farm was waiting. The fields were still there, patient and enduring, the way land always is, outlasting grief, outlasting doubt, outlasting everything except the people stubborn enough to stay. They had both, it turned out, been exactly that stubborn. Some people spend a lifetime searching for solid ground, not knowing it was never a place but a person. Emily didn't just save her father's land that Friday morning. She found the one thing he never put in the will, but always hoped she'd have. Someone who stays not because he has to, but because leaving simply stopped making sense. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. And if you want more stories like this, deeper, more intense, and without interruptions, the link is in the first pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth it.